I want to quickly start out sort of getting an idea of how familiar folks here are with what we're going to do, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do, and then we'll do a little more introduction of who we are and where we come from and what the expertise is that we bring to this. So one of the questions that I want to know is, has anyone here seen the 1990, I think, film Manufacturing Consent? Just a few of you, not most.
I read the book, but not the movie.
My next question is the book which came out 85? In the mid-'80s anyway, that was by Noam Chomsky and Ed Herman, which was called Manufacturing Consent. Okay. So that's fine. I mean, I just wanted to know sort of what level we can start off here on. Are people more familiar generally with Noam Chomsky's work? And have you read any of his books? Or who has read a book by Noam Chomsky? Not a book. I know you've read a book. Everyone here has read at least one book. Okay, so a good half the room isn't really even familiar with Noam Chomsky's work, which I think is really exciting because we want to introduce this idea, and starting with the basics that's why it's called the ABCs. So I think one of the objectives that we have here is to not just teach you the propaganda model that Alison is really going to explain in much more detail, give a thorough instruction on. What it is a way to understand sort of why the media are the way that they are, why the corporate media behave the way they do, why they produce the content that they do, why they have the allegiances that they have. And we think that this is critical for activists and media activists, of course, to understand, because we've got to convey this understanding to society of why we're being treated the way we are by the media, why we're being lied to, why news is being distorted, and in what interests. And having a sort of structural model, a conception of how to do that is it makes the job so much easier. So what we want to do is not just present this model to you, but give you some of the confidence to actually convey it. And we all sort of know that the media are biased, or we all sort of know that there's this leaning or this these lies that we hear. But and I don't just mean we in this room, I think society in general. But to have an explanation of in what ways they're biased, in what ways they filter information, and the effects that it has on society, the effects that it has on democracy. So the reason that a movie called Manufacturing Consent was made in 1990, which is, I do recommend that you all check out this documentary. I think it's free on the internet now. I think it's on YouTube in like 90 parts or something, if not one whole part somewhere. It's really fascinating, and the reason that this amazing documentary was made was because, and it had an enormous impact that we saw in the early 1990s on progressive movements and on progressive media. And the reason is because this model is so amazing at conveying this basic understanding of how the media works, that when people saw this movie, there was a massive influx of folks into the left, into radical activist groups, into social movements, and just into awareness. So that's why we're excited, I think I can speak for both of us, that we're excited to just convey this model to you in one workshop today in such a way that I think that you'll be able to articulate it, you'll be able to understand it, and you'll have a firmer grasp of how to really explain how the media work to people who are out there questioning and looking at the media and saying, I know we're being lied to, I know there's these filters out there, but what are they, and in whose interests is this all operated? They know the general answer, but this gives us a better structure for it. So by way of introduction, I'm quickly just going to introduce myself and my background in this, and then Alison will introduce herself. And then I'll get a little more feedback from you all in case there's any specific interests that you want us to address over the course of the next hour and a half. And then Alison will go into the actual instructive part. And there's going to be a whole lot of participation in here. You're not just going to sit there and be listening to us the whole time. We'll be engaging you pretty thoroughly throughout. So again, my name is Dominick. I've been a media activist for about 20 years, or I guess 19 years. I've been on all aspects of it. I started out in journalism in Syracuse, New York, doing very local work. I did op-ed letters to the newspaper, and I did started working on local progressive newsletters and built up and up in there, and started writing for national news outlets. So I've been doing national journalism in the States for about 15 years, I guess. I worked with Z Magazine, or Z Magazine as you call it here, and ZNet for 8 or 10 years or something. And then I was a co-founder of the New Standard, which is a collective nonprofit online hard news organization that published from January 1st, 2004 through into the middle of 2007, which was it was sort of the exact counter model to the model that you're going to hear about today. So my experience ranges from critiquing, and throughout all of this, one of my main topics of my journalism, of my written commentary, and some of my presentations has been media analysis, how to analyze actual news stories and do case studies on media. So that's the expertise that I bring to this. I won't go any more into that unless you have questions, and then I'll leave it to Alison to introduce herself.
Okay, so I'm Alison Edgley, and my expertise is that I did a PhD on the social and political thought of Noam Chomsky, which was then published as a book 11 years ago. And I did that because between 88 and 91, I did a sociology degree, and then after that I did a master's in political sociology. And at the end of my master's, I was given a book. I think it was a book by Chomsky, I can't remember which one it was. And I read it and I couldn't believe it hadn't been on a reading list. I'd spent 4 years as an undergraduate and in sociology, political sociology, and I hadn't been invited to read Chomsky's work. And I was kind of shocked by that, and particularly because the period I was studying, it was the whole kind of postmodern thing. And so I came out of my degree quite confused about what it was okay to think, and could I have values and be concerned about social justice and so on. So when I read Chomsky writing so assertively, kind of from the left, I wanted to understand how he could be saying what he was saying in the context of all the kind of political and social theory that I'd been reading. So my work essentially was to make sense of what underpinned his assertive account of foreign policy, international relations and so on. What underpinned that? What were his theoretical propositions, his view of human nature, his philosophical propositions as well. So that's what I did in my PhD, and of course part of that was looking at his view of the media. So that's what I'm going to talk about now, the propaganda model and how it works. So, I don't know why this little thing here, can I get that off? Yeah, there. So, Chomsky calls what comes out of mainstream media propaganda, and it's because they operate within a structural system. And so whilst the output from the mainstream media will challenge some individuals and some elites, and they will challenge governments and policies, they don't actually challenge the system that maintains elite power. So his critique is about the system and the structure, but also the individuals within the system and the structure and how they use their power. So the model in brief is that you have events, data and reality in quotes, and journalists and the media in the mainstream then choose what is newsworthy and what they will publish, what they will put in newspapers, what they will talk about on the television, etc. And the decision about what makes news, what becomes news, Chomsky argues, and Herman, in their model, that there are 5 filters that actually events will go through before they can be said to be newsworthy. So the first filter is the the recognition that mainstream media are themselves corporations. They are part of an oligopoly, and they are multinational companies, and so their purpose is to make a profit. But also it needs to be understood that these organisations, you're required to have a lot of wealth to be able to own an outlet that has any kind of outreach. So historically, the cost of setting up a media outlet has increased and increased and increased, and it's actually made it more and more difficult for alternative voices to be out there in mainstream media. So the mainstream media, the setup costs, the maintenance costs and so on, precludes alternate voices. And the point is that this means that they have a conflict of interest which doesn't get spoken about. They are corporations looking to make a profit. They claim to be the fourth estate. They claim to be about freedom of expression, questioning the power of elites, governments, corporations. They are themselves a corporation. So that's the first filter. Will it serve the interests of the oligopoly or not? And if it doesn't, it's unlikely to make it into the news, the item, the event. The second filter is that mainstream media rely upon advertising revenue. And so if there's a question of an event happening which could challenge the interests of somebody who likes to advertise, then there may be a decision taken that the event should not be referred to. So there's a concern about threatening advertising revenue. And Chomsky wants to make it clear that the purpose of mainstream media is to provide audiences for people who want to sell things. Okay, they're selling audiences, actually. The third filter is that every day the mainstream media need to have news. Every day they need to have items to talk about. And they cannot afford to have journalists in every corner of the world, every city, every place where an event might happen. So they tend to go where they can find news, and then therefore they tend to go to elites. And they tend to go to people like the government in elite sources. So for example, the lobby system in the UK. And they use those sources as credible sources, which then define how the issue, the item, the event is spoken about or reported about. So again, that tends to operate as another filter. If elites, if the government think an item is important, it has importance, and then it gets into the news. The fourth filter is the propensity that elites have to create flack. So if they don't like an item, and you can identify evidence of this, Chomsky's in his work, he provides examples and evidence to back up this theoretical proposition that the elite will attack if their interests are threatened in some way. And they've been shown to have things retracted or not actually making it into the newspaper or onto the news. The final filter is an ideological one, and when Herman-Chomsky wrote their model, propaganda model, the ideological lens was one of anti-communism. And of course that's changed somewhat. We've now got I mean, anti-communism was also a concern to protect and argue for the free market, and more recently we've got the ideological lens of the war against terror. And this is the idea that it becomes an okay process for journalists and ideas in the media to be, it's okay to back the national interest as opposed to others, other people, other interests. So if there's a war, it's about fighting for the national interest. So those are the 5 filters, and Chomsky argues, and Herman and Chomsky argue, that this creates a guided free market in ideas. So it's not like state propaganda, where the press or the media are owned by the state and the state determining what gets put out. There is competition among the oligarchs, and they're privately owned companies, but what comes out is a guided free market, and it's the word guided that's important, because the guide protects privilege from scrutiny and criticism, limits debate, which then restricts public understanding and participation. He also argues that the primary focus of mainstream media is for educated elites, so they don't have too much cognitive dissonance. The idea that it would be too uncomfortable. I mean, Chomsky says somewhere, most people are not gangsters, we steal food from starving children on a mass basis, and that is happening. It would be too uncomfortable for educated elites to be having that put forward. So primarily the propaganda system, he argues, is directed at educated elites so that they can feel comfortable with the status quo. And he's quite interesting on ordinary people, because he says they know what's going on, they understand. And the idea that ordinary people are uneducated or cannot understand the system or cannot understand what's going on is wrong. And he talks about you only have to listen to a sports channel and ordinary people and the kind of knowledge they have historically about a football team or whatever it is, and their opinions and their versions and accounts of events. There's not a lack of intelligence there. So primarily the focus of the mainstream media is towards the educated elites. And within the guided free market is the idea of a virtuous attachment to the idea of democratic government. And central to Chomsky's theory is that the state is a form of elite that concentrates power and inevitably protects the status quo, protects the system. So the idea that there's a change of government and there's a more left-wing government or a more liberal government, ultimately it's still operating within the state system. So he's not making a Marxist critique of political economy. He is also, his criticism rests with the state as well as the economic system. So he talked this morning about state capitalism. The problem is not just capitalism, it is also the influence and power of the state to support capitalism and make it function in the way it does. He argues in many places that capitalism would not have survived without the state. It's a dysfunctional system, and the state is the mechanism that props up, keeps it going, and allows the system to continue. So within the guided free market of ideas, he also has this idea of feigned dissent. So I've kind of made a mistake on this slide because it says homogeneity of state and corporate interests, and what I want to say is there's not homogeneity. They're not a homogenous group. There is conflict between elites. So he's not arguing that they're a homogenous, it's not a conspiracy, there's not people sitting in smoke-filled rooms. I mean, this does happen, but that there are conflicts of interest among elites, that does happen. And feigned dissent is the idea that debate and dispute is encouraged, but within limited bounds. Okay? And all the while you've got dispute and dissent, you maintain the myth that there's a free market of ideas. Okay, so it's system reinforcing. The fact that there's dispute, the fact that there's debate, helps to maintain the notion that the press is free and media is free and is creating a free market in ideas. So examples are the freedom of speech myth applies to the media, and of course Chomsky would say it is a myth. It's not about freedom of speech. There isn't a free market in ideas, that it's heavily guided, that it's very much about protecting certain interests, elite interests. And then the example of feigned dissent is that, I mean, there are many examples, but where you'll often see it is around when, for example, a country goes to war, and there's a dispute not on whether to have the war, but on how to complete it, how best to carry it out. So you'll see dispute there, but the question of whether we should have gone to war or not is not really raised. So that's the model, and then he says, invites us to think about ways in which we can verify the model, and says that there are 3 empirical tests that can be carried out to test the model. So, and I'm using here classic examples from his text, and obviously there's more contemporary examples. Is news coverage independent? So he gives examples of, he looks at Watergate, which is held up as a classic example of the media having independence and exposing elite wrongdoing. But what he does when he studies that period in news journalism and so on is identify that at the same time as Watergate, you also had harassment of the Socialist Worker Party, this is in America, and also systematic terror against Black Panthers. And the police murdered Fred Hamilton and Fred Hampton, sorry. And he says, you know, this is a Gestapo-style political assassination. But it had very little coverage compared to Watergate, which was elites attacking elites, effectively. That had so he says that shows you it's not independent in that respect. The second test is the use of paired examples, where you look at the coverage of 2 types of event. So the example he gives is a Polish priest, and again this is reporting in America. The Polish priest was regarded as a worthy victim and had twice the coverage of 100 Latin American religious figures. Poland, the idea, because Poland was communist at the time and therefore was an enemy state, the victims of the enemy state are worthy victims, whereas the victims of a client state in Latin America that they're funding are unworthy victims, and they don't get the same coverage. So, and what he does is he looks at the amount of coverage and shows the disparity, but it's not just the amount of coverage, it's where it sits in a newspaper. Was it page 1 or page 8? But also the rhetoric that's used. So, for example, the coverage of the Polish priest involved indignation, the language was indignant, and there was very little of that around the Latin American religious figures. The third question of whether the third empirical test of the model is how many alternative interpretations do you get? Test the range of opinion on important topics, whether alternative voices actually get into the story, into the analysis of events. And Chomsky's own voice is, in America in particular, very absent. Okay, so his own version and account is very absent. So that's essentially the model. So it's about recognising that the media, mainstream media, are themselves a powerful organisation with corporate interests. And so they're just like any other organisation, any other large multinational organisation. They have interests and they will be looking to serve those interests. They are not, therefore, about freedom of speech and so on. Do big organisations present a positive view of themselves? Yes, they do, and so do the media, using their own pages. Do they misrepresent the truth? Yes, and does this happen often? Yes. And I mean, this is critical because, you know, what happens is when something gets exposed, when their wrongdoing gets exposed, often they'll look to say it's an exception, it's an exceptional case, and they want to argue that it's accidental or it's a rogue somebody or other or so. It's not, it's part of the system. Are there penalties for these activities? No, they're not. And have these issues been documented over time by those who don't espouse the propaganda model? Yes. And do they have special access to government? Yes, they do. And they have influence on media policy and tax regimes that directly affect them. So they're powerful, and they're, you know, one of the points he's often making is that elites look after each other, and they're all interconnected in that way, both corporate and political elites. So that's it in a nutshell.
So that was a 15-minute presentation of something that is documented throughout Chomsky's and other people's work. It's documented by analytical organizations like Media Lens here, or like Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting in the U.S., where the empirical studies, the case studies, are all laid out. So the one thing that we're missing with not having Milan here, who was supposed to be here, is he had a lot of contemporary examples that he was intimately familiar with from current UK media. I can, lend a little bit more of that from the U.S. perspective, but what I'd really like to do is start getting some, this is a lot, and it when we just throw it at you, it sounds like, okay, it's just a conspiracy theory. That's the response that we get. It's the response that Chomsky gets when he presents this almost every time. And that's because at first it almost seems like one, because how this actually plays out in media isn't all that clear. But I'd like to hear some of the responses from folks, challenges to this, or ways that it seems a little bit off, or could be better explained, or any kind of first responses that folks have. Yeah, go ahead.
I start with a point you made, which is about whatever the media do, and then with bias. I think in Britain, we've got a lot of national newspapers, and simply speaking, I would say we've got two leftish ones, and the rest are sort of rightish. So how do you decide where the bias is, left or right, or do they balance them out if you read them both? The same thing, it does strike me that it's a very American-centric model, because America's only really got one national newspaper and it's not really read everywhere, that their newspapers are large and, you know, about their area, and they don't seem to be like British newspapers at all. And thirdly, don't you feel that it seems to me to have missed out the readers? I mean, like yesterday, I picked up the Metro. The Metro had about that much space in a huge newspaper that could be in any way regarded as anything to do with political. All the rest was to do with, I don't know what you call them, celebrities, pop people, and sport. But there wasn't really much room for them to be biased anywhere at all. It was just as though, did they miss out the politics to please the, what you call the elite, or did they miss it out because their readers didn't actually want to read it?
Those are three excellent questions.
Well, in terms of the choice of media, you talked about a couple of leftish type and a couple of right-wing papers.
Yeah, the rest are right wing.
Yeah.
There are two left and they're all
The rest are right.
The Independent Guardian, the national
okay,
newspaper?
I can't be independent. Independent Guardian and the Observer.
The Observer, okay.
Yeah.
Which is not
Yeah.
Guardian?
Like Guardian.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
The rest are all right.
Yeah. Well, one of the points that Chomsky makes, and I think he kind of alluded to it this morning, is that one of the most honest papers about what's going on is the Financial Times.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, which is essentially a right-wing paper in that it is, you know, about business. It's about
facts, you've got on with it. This is the price of that.
yeah. So, I mean, he reserves quite a lot of his criticism for the liberal, the left wing, because they're looking to tinker with the system but not actually challenge it. So, sorry?
I think they challenge what David Cameron doing. They're always making fun of all these one piece of movement. David Cameron.
But they don't advocate revolution, isn't it? They never go very far. For me, they always seem to kind of stop at these very kind of tinker-like criticisms.
Yeah.
That, like,
Yeah,
just,
but what I would say is, where is the bias most? Then it says that they're all biased. And we've got three left-leaning papers and the rest are right-leaning. So do we say they're all biased, or if we add them together, would I get a balance? If I read the whole lot, if I read the Mail and what else would I read? The Express and the Independent and the Guardian every day, would I come out to the balance?
Well, I mean, again, I think Chomsky says that many events do make the news, and so if you're very careful about how you read it and you're very prepared to be critical and ask questions of the implicit assumptions of the way things are being written, you can make sense of what's going on.
Yes.
But you have to work hard at
And
it.
I was wondering who the elite was that the Sun was addressing. And you were saying that most newspapers were addressing, really had their audience with the elite. I couldn't understand where that was for some newspapers.
The general, no, I'm not, well, I'm not, in that instance, I'm not talking specifically about the Sun, but I'm talking about the emphasis in the way in which stories are presented, in terms of defence of foreign policy,
Well, I
or,
don't say the Metro had about, they didn't hardly touch on foreign policy.
well, yeah.
Someone's dead, that's it.
Okay, well, I think that there's a few things to understand about what we're talking about when we say, okay, the Independent Guardian, I've read them quite a bit. They're better than almost any newspaper, probably any newspaper we have in the States, so especially for international news, and even for a lot of US news,
Yeah.
I turn to those sometimes. They're better, but they still are within a very, very narrow framework of debate. Now, I wouldn't say, like you said, they don't advocate revolution. I don't need a newspaper to advocate revolution. I couldn't give a shit what they advocate. I want to hear a diverse set of voices. I want to hear a broader range of sources. I want to hear sources that are valid. So I want to hear public interest groups. I want to hear grassroots activists. I want to hear people who are on the ground. I want to hear the people who are most affected by issues. And some of you may love the Independent or Guardian, but I will tell you, when I was doing media analysis for a living, they were my two favorites, because they do have this presentation that they're progressive, but they're not. Their sourcing is utter shit. They still use undisclosed sources all the time. They're still trying to snuggle up with, I'm sorry, but this is I can do case example after case example. Their standards are so low for actual journalism because of these same filters. The Guardian is owned by a trust. It doesn't have quite the ownership issues, but they still have to maintain advertising. They still have to snuggle up to sources that people feel are, because they've created a culture of these inside government sources and these inside corporate and inside Wall Street in the city. These sources are the ones to listen to. And the people who are getting those interviews, the people who are conveying those sources are the most authoritative. And by people, I mean institutions, really. So these newspapers. Also keep in mind that we're talking about, it's not just about the newspapers. The newspapers, by and large, do better reporting, we know, than television. This model applies directly to all the major television networks in the United States and all the major TV here, including the BBC, which again has a different ownership model, but we know that it's a fairly corrupt ownership model for reasons I think are probably pretty obvious. And similarly, we have the National Public Radio and PBS in the United States. So I think that you have to look at the broader range of what could be discussed, and then you can see, well, gee, if I want to know a broader range than I would get from the Telegraph, I might also pick up a copy of The Independent, which I literally did yesterday for the first time in my life because I'm here in London, and I grabbed both of those two papers because I wanted to see what they actually look like. And I wasn't surprised. You get a certain range, but you're just going to get that much range. But when it comes to the actual practices and those filters that Alison was just explaining, they still apply even to the so-called progressive newspapers. And as long as they do, because they're in business to make money, they're still going to generate a product that is, in general, within that rubric. And that's the problem, is that the limitation of debate, that concept of feigned dissent, that they're allowed to pretend that there's dissent, they're allowed to say there's dissent and show the dissent as long as that dissent is within a very narrow range.
Okay, I still think, like selling anything, like a car with brand of butter, they're always thinking of their end user, the person who wants that newspaper.
Right,
And
that was a very astute point that you make. Alison brought up the idea about sports, and we know that entertainment and sports coverage they sell newspapers, if you watch television news in the States, and I've watched the BBC quite a bit when I've had the opportunity, and they're much better about this, but this is my lesson to you. I know that a lot of you probably watch the BBC and think, why are they doing all this crap on here? It's better than the States, but if you want to see where they're headed, come watch American television, come watch the CNN and Fox and whatever else. And the idea is that, yeah, that sells, but what they're doing is they're distracting people with very analytical, very emotional even, perspectives and views and presentations on stuff that isn't remotely important to their lives. So the point is to make people feel passionate about football, about sports, about fashion, about entertainment. And they do a great job of it. I mean, you watch sports reporters that are so fascinating if you actually pay attention. I don't know what the hell they're talking about, but I'll watch and be like, these people are captivating. They are inspiring intellectual discourse. They have people calling into these shows and arguing against each other in ways that you're just like, holy shit, I've never heard two progressives duke it out quite that knowledgeably about a subject. So they're flexing these muscles, but it's a major distraction.
Because people enjoy it.
And it is because of what people want. So I'm going to try to very, very briefly look into this one more element of this, which is that journalism ends up being a public good. It's out there in the public. Once it's out there, anybody can use it. So when a newspaper wants to do something in the public interest, they have to keep in mind that they're only going to make just so much money on these things. And the things that are the real money makers are the things that are going to get them exposure and broaden their audience. So they're going to lean toward that. But again, this is an effect of, none of this, what we're saying is that these news organizations are morally corrupt. What we're saying is that they're structurally corrupt. And even if it was only because we're in a capitalist system with a market that says, hey, we're only going to make you rich if you cater to our needs, even though they're peculiar and they're not necessarily productive for democracy and they don't make an informed citizenship, we've got a problem right there. And that's where we have to go all the way back to and start at what is the purpose of media, what is the purpose of the corporate media, and their purpose is to make money. It is not to inform journalism. And that's where they're headed, and they've always been headed that way. And they've come back and forth and played with that, but that's really where they always end up is, you're right, where can we make a buck? That's, everything you say is right, and it doesn't contradict this model at all.
You just missed a chunk out, which is pleasing your end user.
I agree with you. How about there in the back?
Yeah, so I just wanted to take a point really from what the lady was saying about propaganda. Propaganda clearly only works, is only successful as those that are induced by it. And you talked about people want things. It's the case of whether people want things or whether they're being induced to wanting those things. I mean, clearly you talked about on TV now we have an X Factor and various other spurious rubbish really that deflects what's really happening. And I suspect part of the whole propaganda machinery is not only purporting what they want in their own interest, but inducing things out there such that we are not actually getting involved in the things that actually matter to us. We talk about education in this country, which is pretty poor. We've got figures in London about the poor rates of reading, writing and maths for young school children. How are they able to then intellectually discern what's actually going out there for them? And then, of course, they'll just end up being interested in things like trainers and boots, and you can see in the riots down in Clapham, there's a classic case that the one store that wasn't seized upon was a bookstore. I mean, that's a clear reflection. It's a clear reflection of what these people want, and they're the basic goods that clearly the power elites are selling to us. So you can see there's a whole intricate thing that's coming together, and really we need to really disfragment a number of these things. So it's really down to the readers, it's down to us, it's down to the viewers of BBC, and contrast the BBC with perhaps Russian, the RT TV, where they purported a lot of things about what's going on in Greece and various other things that are going around in the capital. But if you look at the BBC, you wouldn't think they were happening. So you can see there's a lot of intricate things there, and clearly about what people want. Is it what people want, or are we already being induced into taking the very things that the propaganda machinery wants us to take?
I don't have much to add to that.
No.
Oh, great, that's great.
Yeah.
I'm quite a novice at all this. This is all new theory to me. I always suspected there was quite a lot of dodgy things going on in the media. But I'm just wondering if you're aware of, there's a fairly new TV channel called Community Channel, which is on Freeview. I don't know if anybody's seen it. And they seem to report things which are sort of global stories, quite important things, environment related, community related. I'm just wondering if you think they have managed to break free of this propaganda model, if you think they're actually still operating within that.
You'd have to apply one of the 3 empirical tests to judge, really. I don't know, I've not seen it, so I can't judge it, but it would be interesting to look at. I mean, one of the things Chomsky says is look at implicit assumptions of how things are being reported, what's being assumed that's not being said, and that can actually reveal quite a lot about people's values and position on something.
I think the community TV, is it community channel?
Community
Yeah,
channel,
yeah.
media
I think there's a whole range of different funders to that, isn't there? And I think News Corporation are part of that. And so I know Undercurrents were commissioned to produce a TV, kind of a short series on, it's called Living in the Future, and it's about sustainable living and things. And that's kind of, to a certain degree, I think it's kind of digestible by that system, but it doesn't go as far as some of their other Undercurrents, other more independent work, in that it's not very critical of capitalism, for example. It doesn't join the dots between environmental destruction and capitalism and what it's doing to the planet. So to a degree, I think there's probably, like, you could apply the ideological lens in that it's kind of going to be amenable to a certain extent, and it can be critical within a kind of, to a limited degree, but I don't think they would, I don't know, I mean, I haven't done a study of the whole range of broadcasts, but yeah, I think you probably could apply the model to it, and it's ultimately biased.
The first thing to do is look at the filters and see which ones definitely apply in terms of ownership, if they are advertising driven, which almost all media is. Those are the reasons to be suspicious. So if they're owned by News Corp, big reason to be suspicious. If they have advertisers, it's difficult to believe that they would do something that would contradict their advertisers. But that doesn't prove anything, so that's why Chomsky and Herman set up these tests. But I think the case study, the comparative examples, is really the way to do it. So if you watch them for a while and you watch how they handle one issue that where they may seem to reinforce, ideology, establishment opinion, and then look at other ones where they would have an opportunity to contradict that, and see where the balance lies. So sometimes it's just a matter of looking at two different stories and seeing. We bring our biases to this, though, we have to remember. So it's important to not just quickly judge by one episode of one thing that you see, or one article in a newspaper, but these things have to be established over time. But it has been done over and over again, and we can get a good narrative of what a news outlet's perspective and experience product is based on some of these studies that have been done.